The rain had been falling on the Wexford road since noon, and by the time the last coach rocked into the yard of the Coach and Anchor, the light had gone the color of pewter, and the puddles had climbed the cobbles like something rising. Cassandra Marrow stood in the doorway of the inn with a lantern held high and watched the passengers descend, and she counted them the way she counted everything now, quietly, without being seen to count 6 inside. 2 on the roof, soaked through. A gentleman, Lest, in a traveling coat too fine for the North Road, who paused on the step with a leather case pressed under his arm, as though the case mattered more than the rain. She did not know him. She knew, in the way a body knows weather before the sky admits it, that he had come for something. To the yard she was the girl who kept the ledgers and carried the trays, the innkeeper's clever help, who could reckon a bill in her head faster than the ostler could saddle a horse. To the coaching road she was Miss Marrow, no more than that, a plain young woman in a grey stuff gown who had appeared at the Coach and Anchor 2 winters past with a single trunk and a manner too fine for her circumstances. Nobody at the inn knew what she had lost. That was the arrangement she had made with herself. She had folded the loss small and put it somewhere the daylight could not reach, and she carried it the way she carried the lantern, steadily, so the flame would not gutter. She showed the wet gentleman to the private parlor and set the fire going, and did not ask his name, because it was not her place, and because asking was a way of being remembered, and she had learned to prefer being forgotten. 2 years is a long time to prefer being forgotten. Stay with me, and you will see how a single sealed case, carried into a rain-wet inn by a man she had never met, undid the whole quiet architecture of her forgetting. She had been born Cassandra of Ashwell Grange, and for the first 19 years of her life, the word Grange had meant floors that smelled of beeswax, and a library her father let her wander at will, and a long green run of park where the deer came down to the ha-ha at dusk. Her father had been a gentleman of modest fortune and immodest kindness, a widower who taught his only daughter Latin because she asked and mathematics because she was better at it than he was. He kept his own accounts in a hand she could have read, blindfolded, every column ruled, every sum carried, every tenant's name spelled with the same small courtesy he gave a duke. Then he died, in the space of a single autumn, of a fever that took him in 11 days, and within the month the whole shape of her life had been quietly, legally, unanswerably taken from her. The instrument of the taking was her father's cousin, Mr. Silas Ashworth, a man she had met perhaps 4 times in her childhood, and disliked on each occasion, for reasons she had been too well bred to name. He arrived at the Grange 3 days after the funeral, with a solicitor and a document, and the document said that Ashwell Grange and its lands and its rents were entailed away from the female line, and that he, Ashworth, was the heir at law, and that Miss Marrow might remove herself and her personal effects by the quarter day. He said it in the drawing-room where her mother's portrait hung with his hat still on, and he said it as a man reads a price aloud. She had asked to see the accounts. That was the one thing she had asked. Her father had left no debts that she knew of, and she wished to understand how a girl could go from an heiress to a beggar in the turning of a season. Mr. First, Ashworth had smiled and told her that the affairs of the estate were no longer her concern, and that a young woman troubling herself over ledgers was an unbecoming thing, and that she would do better to cultivate gratitude for the small annuity his generosity permitted her. The annuity was £40 a year. The Grange returned nearer 3,000. She had done the arithmetic in her head while he spoke, and she had said nothing because there was nothing to be said to a man who held the law in one hand and her home in the other. She did not take the annuity. She took her mother's ring and her father's signet, and a small green-bound book of his in which he had copied out the poems he loved, and she walked out of Ashwell Grange on the quarter day with a single trunk, and she did not look back at the deer or the ha-ha or the windows, because looking back was a luxury, and she had just been taught the price of luxuries. That was the wound, and she did not speak of it. To speak of it was to invite pity, and pity was only another way of being told she was small. The gentleman in the private parlor stayed the night, and the next morning, and the morning after that, and Cassandra learned his name from the register in her own hand, because he wrote it there himself. Mr. Greng. Thomas Brandon of Lincoln's Inn, a man of law then. A man who traveled the North Road in foul weather with a case he did not let out of his sight. She might have thought no more of it. Inns are full of men with cases. Yet on the third evening, she carried his supper up herself, because the girl who usually did it had gone home to a sick mother, and Mr. Deed Bea. Brandon had his case open on the parlor table, and spread across the boards were columns of figures in a ruled and careful hand, and Cassandra stopped in the doorway with the tray in her two hands and felt the floor of the world tilt very quietly beneath her. She knew that hand. She had read that hand, blindfolded. It was her father's, Mr. Brent. Brandon looked up and saw her face and rose at once, and he asked her, in the low, even voice of a man accustomed to bad rooms and worse news, whether she was unwell. She said she was not. She did not look at the papers again, because to look was to give herself away. And 2 years of preferring to be forgotten had made her very good at not giving herself away. Her hand, when she poured his wine, was not quite steady, and Mr. Send. Brandon marked the not quite and said nothing. And that saying nothing was the first thread of the thing that followed. The season that year had brought a great house back to life not 4 miles from the inn. Rothmere Hall, shut up for 3 years while its master was abroad, had thrown open its shutters in September, and the whole district spoke of nothing else. The Earl of Rothmere had come home. He had come home changed. They said, colder, quieter. A man who had gone away to bury a grief and come back wearing it like a coat he would not take off. Julian Vane, the 6th Earl of Rothmere, 34 years old, tall, dark, with a face the local gentry described as handsome and unapproachable in the same breath. Cassandra had seen him exactly once, from a distance, when his carriage stopped at the Coach and Anchor to change horses, and he had stood in the yard while the ostlers worked apart from everyone, looking at nothing, his gloved hand resting on the head of a walking cane he did not need. She had thought, that is a man who has learned the same lesson I have, that the world takes and calls the taking law, and expects you to be grateful for the annuity. She had not expected to meet him. Their lives ran on different roads. The morning after Mr. Ridger, Brandon spread her father's hand across the parlor table. The Earl of Rothmere's steward rode into the yard with a message, and the message was that his lordship required a private room at the inn that afternoon for a meeting of business, and that he would bring his own party, and that the innkeeper was to ensure their discretion. The innkeeper, flustered by an earl, put Cassandra in charge of the room. Dentist. She laid the fire and set the chairs and made certain the shutters closed cleanly, and she was still at the sideboard when the party arrived, and so she was in the room invisible in the way that useful people are invisible, when the Earl of Rothmere sat down across a table from Mr. Blanca. Thomas Brandon of Lincoln's Inn and Mr. Brandon opened his leather case. She should have withdrawn. A well-trained servant withdraws. Yet the Earl, settling his gloves upon the table, said without looking up that the girl might stay and see to the fire, that he disliked a room going cold during business, and so Cassandra stayed, and kept her eyes on the coals, and heard every word. What she heard was this, that Mr. Bexure, Brandon had been engaged some months past by a party who wished to remain unnamed to investigate the affairs of a certain estate in the north, an estate called Ashwell Grange, lately come into the possession of one Ashworth by right of an entail. That Mr. Gay, Brandon, examining the papers, had found the entail itself to be sound, but had found something else, something in the accounts, that had made him take a coach north in the rain, with the proof of it locked in a case beneath his arm. Cassandra knelt at the hearth of a coaching inn, and heard her own name, her own house, her own father's hand, described by a stranger to an earl, and she did not drop the poker, and she did not gasp, and she counted her breaths the way she counted the passengers, quietly, without being seen to count. The Earl of Rothmere listened without expression. When Mr. Brandon had finished, he asked a single question, and the question was what, precisely? The accounts revealed. And Mr. Brandon answered that the entail had carried the land lawfully to the male heir. The entail, however, did not carry the personal fortune. Ashwell Grange had held, at the time of the old gentleman's death, some £11,000 in the funds, Money that belonged not to the estate, but to the daughter. Money over which the heir-at-law had no claim whatsoever. And that money was gone. It had been moved, in the weeks after the funeral, by a hand that had forged the dead man's signature into accounts controlled by Ashworth. The forgery was clumsy. Mr. Beckrey, Brandon had the genuine signatures and the false one, and to any careful eye they were not the same. £11,000. Cassandra had lived on the arithmetic of 40 a year for 2 winters, and here, in a shuttered-in parlor, a stranger was saying that £11,000 of her own money had been stolen with a forged pen, and that he could prove it. She rose from the hearth. She could not help it. She rose, and the poker was still in her hand, and both men turned to look at her. And for one long moment the whole business of the room hung on what the innkeeper's clever help would do. The Earl of Rothmere looked at her, and something moved behind his still face. Some recalculation, quick and complete. He did not know her, yet he knew, as Mr. Ress. Brandon had known over the wine that this was not the composure of a girl who had heard nothing. "Sit down," he said. It was a command, level and low, and Cassandra had spent 2 years obeying commands from men who did not see her, and she nearly obeyed this one from habit. Then she remembered that her father's hand was on that table, and her father's fortune was in that stranger's case, and she was done, in that instant, with being forgotten. "That is my father's account," she said. "My name is Cassandra Merrow. Ashwell Grange was my home. You have waited, as I have, to hear her say her own name in a room that could not unhear it. She had waited 2 years. She said it plainly, and she did not weep, and the fire behind her did not gutter. The silence that followed was not the silence of disbelief. Mr. Brandon had gone very still, the way a man goes still when a locked door opens by itself. The Earl of Rothmere did not move at all, but his eyes went over her once, the grey stuff gown, the reddened knuckles, the steady mouth, and Cassandra saw him see her, saw the whole shape of 2 years read in a single unhurried glance, and she braced for the pity that always came. It did not come. Instead, the Earl asked Mr. Brandon quietly whether it was usual for the injured party to be discovered kneeling at the hearth of the very inn where the proof of the injury had come to rest. Mr. Brandon said that in 30 years of practice he had never once known it to happen, and the Earl said, still quietly, that he had learned to distrust a coincidence and to trust a providence, and that they had best give the lady a chair. They gave her a chair, and Cassandra sat down at the table where her ruin and her restoration lay side by side in a stranger's careful hand, and she began, for the first time in 2 years, to be seen. It emerged, over the hours that followed, that the unnamed party who had engaged Mr. Brandon was the Earl himself. He had a reason, though he did not give it fully that afternoon, and Cassandra did not ask, because she had learned that a man's reasons are his own until he chooses to lend them. What he gave her instead was a plain account of the mechanism. Ashworth had overreached. Not content with the land, he had taken the funds, and to take the funds he had forged a dead man's name. And forgery was not a matter. The law forgave, not even for a gentleman, not even for an heir-at-law. The land might be lost to the entail. The fortune, though, could be recovered, and the man who had stolen it could be broken by the recovery if the proof were placed before the right authority in the right way. "Why," Cassandra asked him, "does an earl trouble himself over the stolen funds of a stranger's daughter?" The Earl of Rothmere was a long moment answering. His gloved hand had come to rest, she noticed, against the breast of his coat, over some inner pocket, in a gesture she did not yet understand. "Because I once let a wrong stand," he said at last, "when I might have prevented it, and a person I owed my protection paid the whole cost of my silence, I do not intend to let a wrong stand again." And then he stopped, as a man stops at the edge of a well. And he said no more, and Cassandra understood that she had come to the edge of his wound and that he would not let her look down into it. She did not press. Instead, she carried the shape of it away with her, the gloved hand at the breast, the person he had owed his protection, the whole cost paid by someone else, And she found, to her own surprise, that she thought of it often in the days that followed, that thinking of his wound was easier than thinking of her own. The days that followed were not simple. Mr. Brandon could not simply hand £11,000 back across a table. The money sat in accounts Ashworth controlled, and Ashworth was not a fool, whatever else he was. He had friends of consequence, and the most formidable of them was a woman. Her name was Lady Vane, the Dowager Countess of Rothmere, the Earl's own stepmother, and she was the second body of the thing that pressed on Cassandra, though Cassandra did not learn it at once. The Dowager had raised Ashworth's suit for her own niece, a match that would bind the Ashworth money, wherever it had come from, to her family's declining fortunes. She had a niece to place, a girl called Miss Georgiana Pruitt, 17 and lovely and entirely without a portion, and Ashworth's stolen £11,000 would have made Miss Pruitt a very tolerable bride. The Dowager did not know the money was stolen. Or she knew, and had decided, in the way of people whose script had worked everywhere, that it was not her concern how a gentleman came by his fortune, only that he had one. Cassandra met the Dowager Countess first at a distance, and then, disastrously, up close. The Earl, in the course of the business, required Cassandra at Rothmere Hall. There were papers she alone could authenticate, her father's true hand against the forged one, and Mr. Brandon needed her testimony, sworn and witnessed. So the innkeeper's clever help was sent for in the Earl's own carriage, and she arrived at Rothmere Hall in her grey stuff gown, and she was shown not to a servant's passage, but to the library, and the Earl met her there himself, and for a little while, among his father's books, Cassandra was again a gentleman's daughter in a gentleman's library. And the 2 years fell away from her like water off glass. It was in the library that she first felt the thing she had no name for. He had brought her a document to read, one of Mr. Docus Brandon's fair copies, and he laid it before her on the great table where the winter light came sideways through the tall windows and lay in long, pale bars across the leather and the ink. He stood close while she read it, closer than business required, one hand resting on the table's edge, and Cassandra bent to the columns and found that the columns would not hold still in her mind. She was aware of exactly where he was in the room. Without looking, she was aware of the faint scent of him, of cold air and clean linen, and the smoke of a fire he had ridden in from. She was aware of the warmth of him at her shoulder, and aware, with a kind of quiet alarm, that her own pulse had begun to keep a time that had nothing to do with the sums in front of her, that her breath had gone shallow, in a way no ledger had ever made it go. She turned a page. His hand came to steady the paper, and his bare fingers were near her gloved ones on the table, not touching, a half-inch of charged air between them, and neither of them moved to close it, and neither of them moved away, and the fire in the great hearth said something soft to itself. And Cassandra understood that she was in some danger she had not reckoned on. She read the document twice, and comprehended it once. When she had done, she looked up, and the Earl of Rothmere was looking at her, not at the paper, and his still face was not still. He stepped back. "Forgive me," he said low. "I keep you too close to the work." But he did not say what work, and they both knew the work was not the reason he had stood so near. That was the first beat of it. There would be others. The Dowager found them there. She came into the library on some pretext of her own, and she took in the scene. The innkeeper's girl, in grey at the great table, her stepson standing near, and her fan came up half an inch too high, and her greeting to Cassandra was a small masterpiece of civility, calibrated to wound. "How good of Rothmere," she said, "to interest himself in the affairs of the lower sort. He was always tender toward strays." She let the word rest in the air. Stray. She said it as a woman lays down a card she is certain will take the trick. And then she turned to her stepson and spoke of dinner and of Miss Pruitt, who was expected, and who played the harp so prettily. And Cassandra stood at the table with her father's forged fortune under her hand and understood that in this house she was astray, and that the Dowager had decided it, and that the dowager's decisions had the weight of law in the rooms the dowager ruled. The earl said nothing to defend her. Cassandra marked that too. He let the words stand, his jaw a shade tighter, his eyes gone to the window, and she told herself she had been foolish to feel what she had felt among the books. That a man does not close a half-inch of air with a stray, that the library had been a trick of firelight and longing and 2 years of being unseen. She rode back to the inn in his carriage with the sworn papers in her lap and told herself all of it, firmly. The whole way. And did not believe a word. What she did not know was that the Earl of Rothmere, after she had gone, stood a long time at the library window with his gloved hand at his breast, over the inner pocket, and that in the pocket was a letter, and that the letter had been written 3 years before by a woman now dead, and that the woman had been his younger sister, and that his sister had died, because a fortune of hers had been stolen by a man the family protected, and Julian Vane had known and had said nothing out of a young man's cowardice and a family's convenience until it was too late to say anything at all. That was the wound. He had let a theft stand once, and a person he loved had paid the whole cost. He did not speak of it. He carried the letter the way Cassandra carried the ring, close where the daylight could not reach it. The recovery moved forward through October. Mr. Brandon prepared his case. And Ashworth, who was not a fool, began to feel the ground shift beneath him, and being unable to see the hand that moved against him, began to strike out at the nearest weakness, which was Cassandra. He came to the coach and anchor himself. He had learned somehow that the innkeeper's clever help was his dispossessed cousin, and he came in a fine coat with a whip in his hand, and he stood in the public room and called for the girl called Marrow, and when she came he looked at her the way a man looks at a debt. "You have been telling tales," he said. "A servant girl, spreading slander against a gentleman. Do you know what becomes of servants who slander their betters?" And he said to the whole public room, loudly enough, that the carters, and the ostler, and the innkeeper all heard it, that Cassandra was a thief's brat and a liar, that her father had died in debt and disgrace, that she had come to the North Road because no honest house would keep her, and that any man who believed a word from her mouth was a greater fool than she. Took him for the public room, was silent. Cassandra stood in her grey gown before the man who had stolen her home and now her name, and the third telling of the word landed on her thief's brat, said this time not in a drawing-room or a library, but here, in the common room, before the people among whom she had made her small, forgotten life. She did not weep. She said quietly that her father had died, owing no man a penny, and that she would say so before any magistrate in England. And Ashworth laughed and struck the table with his whip and told her she would have her chance sooner than she thought, that he would see her charged with slander and turned off the road by Michaelmas, and that no earl and no lawyer would trouble to save a stray. Then he left, and the public room breathed again, and the innkeeper, frightened of a gentleman's power, told Cassandra that perhaps it would be best if she kept to the back rooms until the business was settled. Best for the house. She understood. She had been understanding such things for 2 years. She went to the small, cold room under the eaves where she slept, and she took out her father's signet ring and her mother's ring, and the little green-bound book of poems, and she sat with them in the failing light, and for the first time since the quarter day she let herself feel the whole weight of what had been taken, the house, and the fortune, and the name, and now even the small, safe smallness she had built in its place. This was the dark of it. She had thought she had reached the bottom of loss 2 years before, on the quarter day, walking out of the Grange. She had been wrong. The bottom was here, in a cold room, under the eaves, being told to hide by the one house that had taken her in, while the man who had ruined her promised to finish the work before Michaelmas. She sat very still and did not weep, and the candle burned down, and she thought that perhaps forgetting had been the right instinct after all, that being seen had cost her the little she had left. There came a knock at the inn that night, late after the coaches had stopped. Cassandra heard the innkeeper's voice below, startled and deferential, and then a step on the stair she had learned to know without knowing. She had learned it even and unhurried, and then the Earl of Rothmere stood in the low doorway of the servants' room under the eaves with his hat in his hand. too tall for the space, and looked at her sitting on the narrow bed with her father's ring in her palm. He should not have been there. It was a gross impropriety, an earl in the sleeping room of an innkeeper's maid at midnight, and they both knew it, and he had come anyway. He had heard, he said, what Ashworth had done in the public room. He had written over the moment he heard. He asked her, in the level voice, whether she was harmed. She said she was not. He looked at the ring in her hand, and at the little green book, and at the cold hearth with no fire laid, and something in his face gave way. Some last shutter he had kept closed. "I let this happen to someone once before," he said. "I will not do it twice, and then because the room was small and the hour was late, and 2 years of her forgetting and 3 years of his silence had brought them both to the same narrow place under the same eaves." He told her about his sister, about the fortune stolen and the family that had chosen convenience over truth, and the letter she had written him, begging him to speak, and how he had not spoken, and how she had died, still waiting for him to speak. He told it plainly, without excusing himself, his gloved hand at his breast the whole while, over the pocket where the letter lived. And when he had done, he took the letter out and held it, not offering it, only holding it where she could see it, the thing he had carried unshown for 3 years. Cassandra looked at the letter in his hand and at the ring in her own, and she understood that they had each been carrying the same weight down 2 different roads, and that the roads had met at a rain-wet inn on the Wexford Road, and that neither of them was forgotten now. She did not take his hand. He did not reach for hers. She said only quietly that his sister would not have wanted him to carry it alone, and he said, quieter still, that he had begun to think the same, and the half-inch of air between them in the library had followed them here, into the cold room under the eaves, and this time when it might have been closed, it was not, because they were both people who understood the cost of a thing done too soon, and unmade too late. He put the letter away. He said he would come for her in the morning, in a carriage, before the whole county, and that she was to wear no disguise and hide in no back room, because the time for her being forgotten was over. Then he went, and Cassandra lay awake in the cold room with her father's ring in her hand and her heart keeping the time it had first kept in the library, and for the first time in 2 years she was afraid not of loss, but of hope. The reckoning came at Rothmere Hall in the great drawing-room 10 days later, and it came in the arena where the Dowager ruled. Lady Vane had planned an evening. Miss Georgiana Pruitt was to play the harp. Silas Ashworth was to be received as an accepted suitor. The county was to see the Dowager's arrangement crowned. 40 of the district's first families filled the room, the candles throwing gold on silk and diamonds, the Dowager seated in state with her fan at its measured height, and her niece arranged prettily at her hand, and Ashworth standing near with the look of a man whose script had never once failed him. The Earl of Rothmere brought Cassandra into that room on his arm. She wore no disguise. She wore a gown of soft green that had been his sister's, altered by his own housekeeper, and her mother's ring, and her father's signet on a ribbon at her throat where all could see it, and she walked into the drawing-room of Rothmere Hall on the arm of its master, and 40 of the first families of the district turned to look, and the harp went silent, and the Dowager's fan came down. Ashworth understood. First his face, so certain, emptied like a glass overturned. He looked to the Dowager for the script, and the Dowager had no script, because the Dowager had not been told, because the Earl had made certain she would learn it here, in her own arena, before her own guests, as she had made others learn their smallness before her guests for 40 years. "Mr. Demmer!" Branton of Lincoln's Inn stepped forward from beside the door, his leather case in his hand, and beside him a gentleman the county knew well, the magistrate Sir Henry Coode, grave and unhurried, who had come at the Earl's asking, and stayed at Mr. Caperet. Brandon's showing having spent the afternoon comparing a genuine signature to a forged one, and finding, as any careful eye must, that they were not the same. The Earl of Rothmere did not make a speech. He had promised the minimum sufficient thing, and he gave it. He stood beside Cassandra in the center of the bright room, before the 40 faces and the silenced harp and the emptied glass of Ashworth's certainty, and he said 6 words, level and low and carrying to every corner. "This is Miss Merrow. I will marry her." The silence held. It held the way a held breath holds. And into it, Sir Henry Could said, gravely, that he must trouble Mr. Reda Ashworth to accompany him upon a matter of a forged signature and £11,000, and the room which had gathered to see a stray put in her place saw instead a thief taken by the arm, and understood, in the slow collective way a crowd understands, that it had been wrong about which of them was small. The Dowager Countess did not fragment loudly. That was not her way. Her fan closed. Her hand went to the arm of her chair. She looked at her stepson, and at the girl in her dead daughter's green, and at the magistrate leading her chosen suitor toward the door, and the whole architecture of 40 years of certainty shifted a fraction beneath her, and she said, in a voice gone suddenly older, that she had not known. It was not an apology. It was true, though. And it was the beginning of the only correction the niche permits. And Cassandra, who had every reason to want the woman broken, felt instead only a strange, grave pity for a woman whose script had at last met a room it could not play. Miss Pruitt, 17 and lovely and without a portion, sat down at the silent harp and did not know where to look. And Cassandra crossed the room to her, the whole county watching, and said something quiet and kind that the county could not hear, and the girl's frightened face eased, and that was the last verdict of the arena. The stray who had been called a thief's brat showing a startled child, a small unrewarded mercy in the very room where the mercy would earn her nothing. The £11,000 was recovered before Christmas. Ashworth, faced with a forgery he could not explain to a magistrate who had seen the signatures, made what terms he could, and was ruined making them, not by a duel or a scandal cried through the streets, but by the plain, slow machinery of the law he had once held in one hand while he held Cassandra's home in the other. He was not destroyed. He was corrected, and displaced, and quietly undone, and he left the county before the new year. And the county did not speak of him kindly, and did not speak of him long. The land at Ashwell Grange was still lost to the entail. The law that had carried it away was sound, and no forgery touched it. And Cassandra found, when she examined her own heart, that she did not grieve the land as she had thought she would. The Grange had been her father's and her childhood's, and both of those were kept now in the only places that could hold them, in the green-bound book of his poems, and in the hand she had learned to read, blindfolded, and in the signet at her throat. She did not need the deer or the ha-ha. She had needed to be seen, and she had been, and the seeing had done what the Acres never could. They were married in the spring, in the small church near Rothmere Hall, quietly. Brandon, standing witness, and the housekeeper weeping, frankly, in the second pew, and Sir Henry grave and pleased in the third. The Dowager Countess attended. She had, in the winter months, done the slow work that correction asks, and if she and Cassandra were not warm, they were at least at peace, and the Dowager had begun, in small, careful ways, to see the daughter-in-law she had once called a stray. It was not everything. It was enough, and the niche asks only enough. By the following winter, there was snow on the Wexford Road again, and the Coach and Anchor still changed horses in its yard, and Cassandra Vane, Countess of Rothmere, sometimes rode past it in the carriage and looked at the lantern in the doorway, and thought of the girl who had stood there, counting passengers quietly, so as not to be seen. She did not envy that girl. She was gentle with her memory, though, the way one is gentle with a self who survived something. On the last evening of that year, Cassandra sat in the library at Rothmere Hall, in the room where she had first felt the half-inch of charged air, and the fire was high, and the snow came down past the tall windows, and her husband sat near her with his gloved hands bare now, for he had learned to leave the gloves off in this room. And the letter from his sister lay on the table between them, unhidden at last, kept where the daylight could reach it. Beside it lay her father's signet ring, and the little green-bound book of poems, open to a page he had copied out in the hand she could read blindfolded. She read the poem aloud slowly, in the warm room, in the hand she could read blindfolded, and her voice did not gutter, and he listened with his head a little bowed and his bare hand loose upon the arm of his chair. It was a small poem, one her father had loved, about a traveler who comes at last to a lit house in the dark and is taken in. She had read it 100 times as a girl at Ashwell Grange, never understood it, and she understood it now, in this room, with the snow at the glass. Neither of them spoke of the fortune, or the forgery, or the arena, or the 2 long roads that had brought them to this fire. Outside, the snow went on falling on the park where the deer would come down at dusk, on the church where they had married, on the far dark ribbon of the Wexford Road and the small lit inn where a stranger had once carried a case in, out of the rain, and set the whole quiet architecture of forgetting, gently, finely, free. She closed the book. The fire held its light. On the ribbon at her throat, her father's signet caught the flame and gave it back, and that was all. And it was enough. If Cassandra's long road home moved you, stay a moment, and tell me the beat you will remember. Thank you for staying until the end.